evil is really no longer defended today because of Alvin Plantinga's refutation of this about 40 years ago. Alvin Plantinga, who is a famous philosopher of religion, probably the foremost philosopher of religion currently writing, said in a little book called God, Freedom, and Evil, that as long as we recognize that God exists and evil exists are not contradictories to each other. Obviously, the contradictory of God exists is God does not exist, not evil exists. And the contradictory of evil exists is evil does not exist, not God exists. So there's no explicit logical difficulty between these two. Now, if you think there's some implicit difficulty, then it's up to you to spell out exactly what that is. And Plantinga said you could easily dissolve any possible problem that someone might raise by proposing that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil that occurs. So Plantinga said, just for the sake of argument, Plantinga didn't believe this when he proposed it, but he said it could be the case that God decided to create angels with free will. And some angels freely chose to go wrong, and those angels, those bad angels, are causing all of the crime and disease and hurricanes and earthquakes that we see all around us. They're responsible for all the evil in the world. Now, obviously, no one believes that, but that is logically possible. And if so, then it shows that there's no logical inconsistency between God's existence and the existence of evil. So the logical version of the problem of evil is really no longer on the table. Now, we're not out of the woods because that still leaves us with the probabilistic version of the problem of evil. The probabilistic version is still widely popular among atheists and agnostics. And the probabilistic problem of evil says, yeah, it is logically possible that both God and evil can exist, but nevertheless, it's highly improbable. And the probabilistic version of the problem of evil focuses on one particular type of evil, namely gratuitous evil. By gratuitous evil, I mean pointless evil. Evil which only does bad and never does good. Evil which never makes anything better than it could have been otherwise. Evil which has ultimately no purpose. It exists for no ultimate good. It's just there. So, gratuitous evil is the type of evil which atheists and agnostics, many of them, will say cast doubt on the existence of God. And they'll frame their argument like this. Premise one, probably if God exists, then gratuitous evil does not exist. Two, probably gratuitous evil exists. Three, therefore probably God does not exist. Now, you can see in this argument that it's more modest than saying there's a logical contradiction between the existence of God and the existence of evil. All that it's saying is that given the pointless evil in the world, it's improbable that God exists. Now, most theists have responded to this argument from gratuitous evil by denying premise two in the argument. They'll say that the second premise, probably gratuitous evil exists, is false. And what they then proceed to do is to argue that none of the evils in the world, despite appearances, is actually gratuitous. That every single one of the world's evils is permitted by God to bring about some greater good. Now, you might wonder, how can this greater good exist? Obviously, we don't see it, we don't have any conscious knowledge of it, and it might be pretty hard to sell an atheist or agnostic on the idea that everything that you perceive as a pointless evil really has some point, that it really contributes to some greater good that otherwise wouldn't have existed. Now, this, I confess, strains the imagination. I think this is pretty hard to wrap your mind around. I mean, several evils that happen to us all the time. We know pretty much as sure as we know anything that the world would have gone on just the same even if the evils had never transpired. So if I nick myself while shaving, or if I get bitten by a mosquito, or if I stub my toe, or if I get a headache, but I just ignore it and go on with my day, then I can look back on that day and say, gosh, that nicking myself while shaving or stubbing my toe or headache didn't make any difference to the day at all. It would have gone exactly the same if those things had happened or had never happened. So it seems to us that very, very intuitively obvious that certain evils really are pointless, that there's no contribution to a greater good that these evils cause. They just happen, and there really is no point to it. Now, from a more severe perspective, and speaking from a more personal perspective, I myself am a sufferer of a disorder known as obsessive compulsive disorder. I have been conscious of this since the year 2004, when I was first diagnosed with this in my final year of my PhD program at the University of Iowa. And so I oftentimes use examples from the treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder in my writings on gratuitous evil because it makes very good sense. I've dealt with it on a personal level. And the type of OCD that I have is where my brain will send me these false messages, these overwhelming fear, panic-inducing false messages that certainly feel real. And what you are trained to do in order to defeat OCD of this level is to ignore what your brain is throwing at you. To say, all right, brain, you can throw this at me, you can throw the fear and the false message, but I'm just going to think about something else. I am going to ignore it. I am going to live my life exactly as though this were not even there. And then you go completely on with your day, just as if it weren't there. And the more practice you get, the better you are at this, until ultimately you can live a life free of the potentially very disruptive effect of OCD. And so for someone like me, when my brain sends me some type of a false message and I get that sense that I'm about to have a panic attack, then I think, all right, I know what this is. This is just my brain acting up, and I just go on about my business. And if I successfully do that, then I can look back at it at the end of the day and say, gosh, that didn't derail me at all. My day went exactly the same way as it would have gone had that never happened. And it just seems intuitively obvious to me that that evil, that very seemingly threatening evil of that false message conjoined with that overwhelming sense of fear, well, it really didn't contribute to anything. So it seems to us properly basic that there really are gratuitous evils in the world. In other words, properly basic belief is a belief which arises appropriately based on our experience, but which you cannot prove by that experience. However, in the absence of any disproof, any defeater for that, you're rational to hold it. So, for example, your belief in the external world is a properly basic belief. Obviously, you could be a brain in a vat being stimulated by a mad scientist, but in the absence of any disproof of what arises naturally and appropriately as a result of your experience, that the external world is real, you believe that you're here and you go on about your business. And if someone said to you, no, you really are a brain in a vat, then you would say, sorry, the burden of proof is on you. You've got to show me that I'm a brain in a vat. And unless you can do that, then I'm justified to stick with my belief that the external world is real. In exactly the same way, it's a properly basic belief, I think, for every one of us, even those people who try to argue for the so-called greater good defense, that gratuitous evil does exist. We seem to know that as clearly as we know anything else. And if someone wants to say, no, none of the world's evils really is gratuitous, then it is that person who shoulders the burden of proof because they are opposing a properly basic belief. So I think it's an incredibly wrong-headed move for theists to try to go after the probabilistic version of the problem of evil by attacking premise 2, because they're putting on themselves this overwhelming burden of proof of having to show that every single evil in the world, which seems to us gratuitous, really has some greater good attached to it that nobody can see and that no one can detect. And so that doesn't seem very palatable to me. Moreover, I think that there are potentially dangerous theological implications of saying that all of the world's evils that appear gratuitous really are, as a result of some greater good. And that is that if God acts like that, then isn't God guilty of utilitarian thinking? Isn't God guilty of saying that the ends justify the means, that I'm allowing this evil to ultimately bring about this greater good? Now, God explicitly commands people in Scripture not to act that way. We're not allowed to be utilitarians and to think, well, we're going to do this even though, yeah, it's bad, but nevertheless, it's going to bring about a greater good. And so, oh, well, let's just violate the moral rule. No, we're not allowed to do that. And if we're not allowed to do that, and God commands us not to act that way, then it seems like God wouldn't act that way either. So I do think that there's the threat, if you are a greater good defender, if you try to say, no, the problem with the probabilistic version of evil is premise 2, of trying to absolve God of the charge of following the maxim that the ends justify the means. Now, all of that is not to say that I think the probabilistic argument succeeds. I think it fails pretty miserably. But I think it fails miserably because I can test premise 1. Premise 1 said, probably if God exists, then gratuitous evil does not exist. And I want to know why in the heck think that is true. Why think that's probable? I mean, to me, that just seems crazy. Now, let me explain why, to me, from a Molinist perspective, that seems crazy. Well, it seems like there have to be some hidden assumptions involved here. So the atheist or agnostic who says probably if God exists, then gratuitous evil does not exist, that's not altogether clear. You've got to be assuming a couple of things to make that work. And it seems that the atheist or agnostic is assuming 2 things. They're assuming, first, that if God is all-powerful, then God can create a world without gratuitous evil. They're assuming that. And they're assuming, second, that if God is all-loving, then God prefers a world without gratuitous evil. So given that God is both able and willing, it would follow that there is no gratuitous evil. But there is, therefore, they would say probably God does not exist. Now, I think that both of those hidden assumptions are false. For the probabilistic argument to go through, both of those assumptions must be true. And I don't think either of them is true. So let's look at them one at a time. The first one, which says that if God is all-powerful, then God can create a world without gratuitous evil. Well, let's think about this notion of can here. God can do something. Well, Christians believe that God is omnipotent. And you might think that that means that God can do anything. So if God can do anything, then does that mean that God can make 2 + 2 = 8? Or that God can create a round triangle? Or God can create a square that is also a circle or a stone too heavy for himself to lift? Well, not at all. It doesn't mean that. Theologians and philosophers have always recognized that God's omnipotence means that God is able to do anything that is logically possible. It doesn't mean that God is able to do the logically impossible. So when we say that God can bring about a world without gratuitous evil, what we're saying is that that is logically possible. It's logically possible for God to bring about that kind of world. Well, maybe not. Maybe if God really wants us to be free, for us to have what is called libertarian free will. Libertarian free will means the freedom in the normal commonsensical use of the word. The freedom to do anything across the full scope of alternatives. So if I have libertarian freedom, and here down at my feet is this can of Diet Dr. Pepper, then I have the freedom to either drink it or not drink it, or throw the can across the room, or put it down on the floor, or anything else across the wide spectrum of alternatives. Nothing is ruled out. So I'm going to choose to put it down on the floor, but could have done anything else. So that's libertarian freedom. So the question is, in order for libertarian freedom to be possible, let's suppose that God, for whatever reason, wants to create a world with libertarian free creatures. In other words, let's suppose that God wants to create a world that has creatures that can make morally valuable decisions. They can genuinely choose between the alternatives. What's that going to entail? Well, let's think about the natural order first. We all know that there are two broad types, whether we're used to this terminology or not. We all know that there are two broad types of evils. There are natural evils, evils like tornadoes and earthquakes and hurricanes, and there are moral evils, say the Holocaust, and obviously evils of much lesser severity than that. So we've got natural evils and moral evils to deal with. So, is it the case that if God is all-powerful, then God can create a world without any natural evil? Well, let's think about it. God, by definition, is the greatest conceivable being. God is necessary being. In other words, God doesn't depend on anyone or anything else for God's existence. And God has the attribute of perfection. Perfection means completeness or wholeness in each and every respect. So God has completeness or wholeness in each and every respect. Now, if God creates anything and just kinds of lets it do its own thing, then anything that God creates, simply by virtue of God's creating it, is going to be less than God. Anything that God creates is going to be dependent on God for its existence. And it's not just dependent on God in one respect or another respect. Anything that God creates is dependent on God in each and every respect. That is to say, in and of itself, intrinsically, anything that God creates has to be limited in each and every respect. Now, if perfection means completeness or wholeness in each and every respect, and anything that God creates, by definition, has to be dependent on him, and therefore lacks completeness or wholeness in each and every respect, then it seems that evil, and this would be gratuitous evil, there wouldn't be any reason for it, but gratuitous evil would be necessary to the creation, simply because anything that God creates is contingent being, which is limited in each and every respect, that depends on God in each and every respect for its existence. An excellent quote on this topic comes from the philosopher Ed L. Miller. He writes, "It would in fact be logically impossible to have a world without evil. Anything created by God would have to be less than God just by virtue of being dependent on him, and this means immediately that it must be less than perfect. And this means immediately the presence of various sorts of imperfections. How could God create something that was perfect and therefore independent and therefore uncreated? It is logically impossible." And I think Miller is absolutely right, that it's logically impossible for God to create a world without evil. If God chose to create anything at all, evil would necessarily come into existence, not because God created or caused it, but because whatever God created would not be God. It would not have the attribute of completeness or wholeness in each and every respect. And if you think about what evil is, the most famous definition of evil was given by Augustine. Augustine said that evil is a privatio boni, which means a privation of the good. So evil is a lack of good. It is a lack of this complete, limitless fulfillment that equals perfection. So this means that anything that God creates, if left to its own devices, in and of itself, is going to have defects, is going to be incomplete in each and every respect. Now, there is a way out for God. We're not saying that God can't create something that is perfect in one way or another. Rather, we're saying that God can't create anything that's perfect in and of itself. Anything that God creates, if it's going to display perfection, must only do so through being in union with God. So, if God brings something that he creates into union with himself, then God's own awe-inspiring and perfect presence transfers this attribute of perfection, so to speak, and exudes this attribute out so that what is created also displays it. To give an example, suppose that I decide to create a table. Now, that table, by just being a table, is not fluorescent. In other words, that table isn't going to light up by itself and show everybody that it's there. If I put that table in a dark room, people would bump into it because no one would be able to see that the table was there before them. But the minute that I turn on the light reflects off of the table. And so even though the table doesn't have the property of being fluorescent, nevertheless, the light ultimately reflects off of the table, and the table now bears the property of luminescence, of being able to be seen. And in exactly the same way, if God were present in this universe in exactly the same degree that God is present in heaven, outside of space and time, then everything here would be completely perfect. Not because it's perfect in and of itself, but because God would have moved in, so to speak, and therefore it would just display God's perfection, just like the table displays the light from the lamp. So that raises the question, why, if God could stop hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, just by, quote, moving into the universe and being just as present in the universe as God is present outside of time and space, then why in the heck doesn't he do it? Well, here we get to free will, to libertarian free will. From a Molinist perspective, if we have libertarian freedom, that's only possible if God creates the universe at an epistemic distance or at arm's length. In other words, if God were present in our universe in exactly the same way that God is present in heaven outside of time and space, then that would just overwhelm us and would leave us powerless but to give our lives to him and follow him and to do whatever God wants, not because it was by our own free choice. No, we would have no choice. Just like a little shard of metal is pulled quite dramatically by an extremely powerful magnet, and it must go further and further to the magnet. So we would be pulled irresistibly towards God if God were just as present in the universe right now as God is in heaven. So God would just overwhelm us with his glory, his beauty, his majesty, so that we would be powerless but to believe and but to obey. And that's not what God ultimately wants, because that means that people can't really establish a free and voluntary relationship with him. That just means that people would be puppets. They would be forced into communion with him. And that's not at all what God wants. So, in order to get libertarian freedom, God has to create the universe at an epistemic distance, or at arm's length, where God is not displaying the same level of presence that he is in heaven outside of time and space in all his glory. Rather, God is displaying a qualitatively lower sense of his presence here in time and space, a level of his presence that allows for libertarian freedom, but also means that God, like it or not, has to put up with various natural evils that will manifest themselves in the course of the creation. So if God really wants us to have libertarian freedom, then God can't yet, at least, move into the universe. And if God isn't yet living in the universe, the way we think of God living in heaven, then we're going to have hurricanes and earthquakes and tornadoes and all the rest. Why? Because if God did move in right now, then that would obliterate our libertarian freedom. That would obliterate our freedom to choose for or against God. We would have to give our lives to God and do exactly what God wants. So it seems that the only way to say that God can create a world without gratuitous natural evil is if you throw away libertarian freedom. Now, I don't think that God would be willing to do that. Heck, I wouldn't be willing to do that. If I wouldn't be willing to do that, then there's very good reason to think that God wouldn't be willing to do that. So the only way to get rid of gratuitous natural evil is to say that, well, free will isn't all that important after all. God much prefers a world where, I don't know, there are never any tornadoes or there are never any earthquakes, and yet everybody is blindingly followed him, no choice in the matter, versus a world where people freely come into a love relationship with him, but there might be some of these, natural evils that also take place. So it seems like if you grant that libertarian freedom is a valuable thing, then God's just going to have to put up with a world that contains various natural evils. Now, what about moral evil? Well, moral evil goes away just right off the bat, because if human beings have libertarian freedom, and that means the ability to do anything on the moral spectrum, from absolute good to absolute evil to anything in between, then human beings are free to act as they will. And that's based on human beings. That's not the fault of God. So Hitler, if he had libertarian freedom, meant that he had the ability to not only plan to carry out the Holocaust, but sadly to actually carry it out in all of its monstrosity. So that's just part of what libertarian freedom entails. And so here, what's known as the free will defense works quite successfully to say that because humans have libertarian freedom, then this means that there are going to be various moral evils in the world caused by one human being to another human being, and that if God wants us to have genuine libertarian freedom, then again, God's going to have to put up with various moral gratuitous evils that we commit against each other. So, in short, it seems false to think that if God is all-powerful, then God could create a world without gratuitous natural and moral evil if God wants free will. It seems like rather it's the case that if God exists and has created a universe with libertarian free creatures, then gratuitous natural and moral evil would exist. And so if that's the case, then that completely obliterates the probabilistic version of the problem of evil. And therefore, that first premise, which the atheist or agnostic thinks is all big and powerful, just fades away. But remember, that's just one of the two hidden assumptions that the atheist or agnostic is making. Let's go to the second, that if God is all-loving, then God prefers a world without gratuitous evil. Well, this doesn't seem plausible to me at all. I mean, suppose that there are worlds that God could create that had absolutely no gratuitous evil in them. I don't think that there are, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that there are. Let's suppose that there are worlds that God could create with absolutely no gratuitous evil. Well, suppose that these worlds have other issues with them. Let's suppose that the only worlds that God could create with no gratuitous evil in them maybe have 3 or 4 people in them. And if God were to add any more people than that, then there's going to be some gratuitous evil that takes place. Now, does God's being all-loving compel him to prefer one of these sparsely underpopulated worlds where no gratuitous evil takes place to the actual world where all sorts of gratuitous evils take place? Well, that doesn't seem obvious to me at all. So it doesn't seem clear to me that if God is all-loving, then God would prefer a world without gratuitous evil, because these worlds without gratuitous evil, assuming they exist, which I doubt they do, but even if they did, they might have other features which make them less desirable, and therefore they would not be nearly as preferable for God as the actual world. So, what then could the Molinists say even in addition to this? Well, let's get the doctrine of middle knowledge here on the table. All of you have probably heard about the doctrine of middle knowledge at some point in the past. The doctrine of middle knowledge, in essence, says that God knows what would happen under any conceivable circumstance to any conceivable creature or any conceivable being. So if God has middle knowledge, then God knows what any possible free individual, not just any actual free individual, but what any possible free individual would freely do in any set of circumstances in which they find themselves. So if God has middle knowledge, he knows that. If God has middle knowledge, then he knows how every single indeterministic natural process would just happen to unfold. So that's God's middle knowledge, that God not only knows how things could be or how things will be, but how things would be. So God knows how every possible free individual would choose in any set of circumstances in which they find themselves. God knows how the indeterministic processes and the deterministic processes, of course, of nature would unfold in any conceivable circumstances. And so God, armed with that knowledge, now, in terms of God's creation, has to make a choice. So what I'm saying is that God, logically prior to creating this world, you may say, why did God create this world? Why didn't God create some other world? Well, God, prior to creating this world, knew what any possible free individual would freely do in any set of circumstances, how any possible natural process would either deterministically or indeterministically, depending on what natural process you're talking about, transpire in any set of circumstances. And so God, putting all that knowledge together, knows what is going to happen if he were to select any of all of these worlds down here. So you can imagine this infinite range of worlds from which God can choose. So which world would an all-loving and all-powerful God choose? Well, it seems that an all-loving God would prefer a world that is tied for the best. Now, I don't think that there probably is a best of these worlds available, that there's just one that obtains to best status. I think that there are probably an infinite range of worlds that obtain to this best status, and that God, by his middle knowledge, knows which ones they are. So you can imagine what might make a world this, or might confer upon a world this best status. Maybe it's a world which has the lowest amount of gratuitous evil. And maybe it also has the highest amount of people saved. And maybe it has the lowest amount of people lost. And maybe in terms of the people who are saved, their relationship with God is stronger than in other worlds. So you can take into account all sorts of factors like that, all sorts of great-making factors for a world. So what I'm proposing is that if God is all-knowing and God has middle knowledge, then God knows that there's this infinite range of worlds, all of which are equally good. In other words, that have a combination of these features. And so that they're all tied for the best. That you've got worlds with, the lowest amount of gratuitous evil and the highest amount of salvation and the lowest amount of condemnation and the strongest amount of those people who are saved, their communion with God. So you've got all of these worlds which are equally good, and God chooses in his sovereignty from these worlds and picks one to be the actual world. And hence, here we are. So God chooses this world based on the fact that it is tied for the best of all feasible worlds. So it wasn't just that God had to choose this world by virtue of being all good. God could have chosen another world, but that world would have been just as good, all things considered, as this world. And if you say, well, why couldn't God have done any better? Why couldn't God have gotten rid of, say, my nicking myself while shaving? Well, it could be the case that even though we think God could have just eliminated that, nevertheless, if God eliminates that, then God's got to move into the universe and therefore alter the laws of physics and therefore cause all sorts of things that would have collateral damage. Namely, it would take away our free will. And so obviously it's not worth it for God to intervene and sort of come into the universe in all his glory just to prevent me from nicking myself while shaving, or to prevent my brain from sending me some high-grade false message that sends a panic attack, or anything else that might occur in my life. Now, you might say, if this is the case, then what hope ultimately is there for the world? Well, on the Christian view, there's all the hope in the world. There's tremendous hope, because the Christian worldview says that right now we've got the choice. God gives us sufficient evidence, more than sufficient evidence, quite frankly, to know that he exists, to know that Jesus is the decisive revelation of God himself. And therefore, it's up to us. We can freely choose to accept him or to reject him. And God gives everyone a fair shake. God gives everyone an equal opportunity. And so those people who do freely choose to give their lives to God, then those people are, so to speak, sealed in that decision. And those people, when they bodily perish, their souls will go to be with God in heaven, awaiting the general resurrection at the end of the world. And in the general resurrection, at the end of the world, God does move into this universe. And God moves in, and now there's no threat of taking away anybody's free will, because everybody who's going to be raised from the dead has already made a choice to follow God, to love God. they've already said, yes, God, I want you. I've made an uncoerced decision to follow you. And so in the general resurrection, where our bodies come forth from the graves, raised immortal, imperishable, incorruptible, the soul reinfused into the body, and God lives forever on earth in this universe with us in what the Bible calls the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21 and 22. That is a world which, by virtue of God's being just as present here as he now is in heaven, so in the end, ultimately, heaven and earth merge into one, they coalesce, then in that world, there isn't going to be any gratuitous evil, any evil of any kind. And that's not because God has made everything perfect. It's like the table analogy. Rather, it's that everything in creation, we, the universe, the planetary systems, the vegetation cycles, everything just reflects God's goodness. And so at the end of the day, not only is it the case that the probabilistic version of the problem of evil fails, but God turns out to be the only solution to the problem of gratuitous evil. So I think we're ready here for questions and answers, but if you want more information on this topic, I wrote a piece in Philosophia Christi in 2012 on this very issue that goes into a lot more depth, which is called The Existence and Irrelevance of Gratuitous Evil. And if you want to read it, just go to my website, which is www.kirkmacgregor, that's KIRKMACGREGOR.org. So go to that website and then click on articles. And once you click on articles, there are a number of different scholarly articles that you can download, and that's one of the articles. So you can read this to your heart's delight. So, questions?
Well, first of all, thank you, Kirk, for your talk. And we'll open up for questions. Yeah, that'd be fine. All right.
Got to make sure that I can hear whoever's speaking.
Okay, yes, and if you need, I can. Whoops. I can relay too. I had a question. When you were talking. Yeah, here it comes. Oh, was it the light? Oh, okay. Sorry. When you were talking about with respect to natural evil, how do you deal with this idea that it seems like God does choose at times to interfere in the natural world?
Yeah.
And it's almost the way I wrote it to myself was he seems to dabble. I mean,
yeah,
he just healed some people, but he didn't heal everybody. And there were even sometimes when maybe he tried to avoid people that he might have been able to heal. There were some prayer, even today, some people have prayers answered and some people don't have prayers answered. It seems like God protects some and he doesn't protect others. And that part seems like dabbling. It seems arbitrary. How would you address that kind of concern?
I would address that by saying that you're right. The ultimate question on the Christian view is not, will God respond to every evil? The answer to that is an unambiguous yes. The question is, when will God respond to evils? Will God give us a foretaste of the new creation by responding right now to an evil? Or will God say, no, let's wait until the general resurrection, and then I'm going to respond to this evil? And the Molinist has a ready answer for why God chooses to respond when he does. God chooses to respond when he does in order to preserve this world being tied for the best of all feasible worlds. In other words, God knows all of the contingencies, and God may know that if I get involved and show a little foretaste of my glory here by answering this prayer or doing this miracle, then that's going to help, say, the balance between saved and lost in the long run. But if I do the miracle here, then this might hurt the overall balance between saved and lost in the long run. And it's interesting to note that Jesus himself seems to convey exactly this type of thinking. So when Jesus is first told in John chapter 11 about the trials and tribulations of Lazarus, and he's told how sick Lazarus is, and people are pleading with him, come, be with Lazarus, and Jesus at first doesn't go. And then after a while, people say, why aren't you coming to Lazarus? And Jesus tells his disciples, look, Lazarus is dead, and for your sakes, I'm glad that I wasn't there so that you may believe. I'm glad that I wasn't there so that you may believe. In other words, Jesus knew that the balance between saved and lost, that you would get more believers if he chose to miraculously heal Lazarus as he did, as opposed to just going to Jerusalem and healing him right away before his earthly demise, or ultimately waiting until the general resurrection to give Lazarus just recompense for whatever it was that he suffered. So I would say that God, given his middle knowledge, responds to each evil at the point that it would contribute to the overall level of good, all things considered.
Good. Thanks. Good answer. Trevor.
I have a question. Thanks, Kirk, for talking to us tonight. I have a question about I've talked to Tim about this some too. The idea that anything that God creates is, in some sense, can be looked at as evil since it's less than God.
Yes, in some sense imperfect, right.
Yeah, I understand that Augustine made the point that evil is the privation of good.
Right.
But one thing is, he didn't say evil is the privation of the ultimate good or the best. He just said evil is the privation of good, which I take as the complete negation of good. So my question is, how do you look at God as being able to create something that is less than good or that lacks good, when ontologically speaking, God himself is without any absence of good? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think that the answer is because God knew that creating things would be worth it. If the issue seems to me to be God saying, all right, given that I am God, and given that this attribute of perfection, in other words, the way I've defined perfection, completeness or fulfillment in each and every respect. If God knows that that is an incommunicable attribute of God, then God knows if I create anything, then it's not going to have that attribute of perfection just by virtue of my creating it. Now, it could display perfection if it's in union with me, as we will be at the end, as the universe will be at the end. But if it just kind of stands in and of itself and just is left at arm's length, so to speak, at an epistemic distance, then it's going to display some of those defects. And so there, God wouldn't be blamed for this if this is ultimately worth it, if there is going to be some type of ultimate reconciliation of all things in the world. So from a broad perspective, if God knows that by virtue of creating a world and going at arm's distance so that I'm not sure what Augustine himself would say. I'm not sure if your reading of Augustine is more accurate than my reading of Augustine, but I would say that I think of evil as just being any type of lack of good, not an absolute negation of good, not the absolute lack of just anything good. Otherwise, nothing could be both good and evil.
Yeah.
No being could have both good and bad features. And that just seems counterintuitive. So it seems like unless we want to shoulder Augustine with this idea of thinking that everything is, if it's bad, then there's a complete absence of the good, and therefore there's a complete absence of God. And God knows that by creating this world, then ultimately he's going to wind up with creatures who love him, are in this voluntary relationship with him, and it means the fulfillment of bringing people into this inner Trinitarian love relationship. And God knows that there isn't any logical choice. It's not like God is saying, am I going to create a world that is perfect, that's an option for me, or am I not? What I'm saying is, if I'm correct, that perfection is an incommunicable attribute of God, then that's logically impossible. But that's not even on the table for God. So God can't be blamed for doing something that's A, worth it, and B, that the opposite is logically impossible.
Yeah. Okay. So that was good. I agree with all that. My sub question then to that would be: it seems to be possibly a categorical mistake of confusing perfection with goodness.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the question is, and the question that I think goes at the very root of my argument, is whether or not I can interchange a lack of perfection with evil.
Yeah.
I haven't really attempted to define goodness, so I'm not committing myself to any definition of goodness. I think goodness is kind of self-evident. But from my perspective, it does seem that, assuming that I'm reading Augustine correctly, that Augustine had it right, that evil is this privation of good. And if you buy into that, then it seems like my reasoning will go through. If you think that some other line of reasoning will work, then you would have to say, no, that's not the right understanding of evil, that evil really isn't this incompleteness or lack of fulfillment. Evil really isn't this privatio boni, this weak privatio boni, maybe as you would see my perspective as being. But that's, I think, where the conversation needs to be had. And I would say that if you go in your direction, then you would just have to run a different type of argument against the problem of gratuitous evil. I still think you could attack premise one. Still on the second point, that you could say, how do you know that if God is all loving, then God prefers a world without gratuitous evil? Everything I said there would still stand, even if you could somehow say that maybe if we understand perfection or goodness in some different way than I've described, then maybe it is possible for God to create a perfect world. Now, I don't think that it is, but if you think that it is, then, go for it.
I agree with you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Josh.
So by creating the world or the universe is dependent on God and therefore less perfect than God. I think we've established that.
Yes.
So the defects will exist. And that's logically necessary. But would it be logically possible that these defects, these imperfections, could just be on a smaller scale? Is it logically necessary that these defects, these natural evils, kill thousands, millions of people at a time, or could you have these natural gratuitous evils?
Yeah.
More inconvenient as opposed to catastrophic.
I wouldn't say that it's logically necessary, but I would say, given God's middle knowledge, then God is going to select from a world that's tied for the best. And therefore, God is going to select, a world which does have, with all other factors taken into account, the lowest amount of gratuitous natural and moral evil. So when we look at a world and say, well, did it have to be, this way? Well, it seems that it could have been otherwise, but then God wouldn't be choosing one tied for the best of all feasible worlds. God might then be choosing maybe a world that has several less hurricanes or several less tornadoes, but just given the contingencies of everything involved, that maybe fewer people would be saved, or that other types of scenarios might take place. Maybe more terrorism would occur in a world where as many tornadoes and earthquakes don't happen. So I think that even though you don't have to say that it's logically necessary for this evil or that evil to have transpired, nevertheless, that the evils that do transpire, God knows that with all the factors taken into account, that this type of world is the best that God can do. If God could have done better, then God would have.
And can I just follow that up? So if
Sure.
basically, like the amount of these natural evils that we have is kind of coupled with so many other factors that ultimately
Correct.
do a better good. So could you still call them gratuitous evils, evils that completely do not have a point, or would you be able to say that now these things that appear gratuitous to us now have this point of being for the better good that God has chosen, or being tied with the best?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that, because notice that these evils aren't there to bring about a good. Rather, the evils are there and they are just sort of a given. Now, it might be the case that just given contingencies, they bring about good, or it might be the case that, well, God is just stuck with a certain level of evil and they might bring about no good at all. So it seems like there are different levels of evil. Some evils might bring about a good, other evils might not bring about a good. And so what I'm concerned with is those evils that don't bring about a good. Now, I'm not saying that every evil is gratuitous. I've never argued that point, and I think that would be futile to claim. But I am saying that I think the theist is better served saying, yeah, I agree with you, skeptic or objector, that yes, there really are gratuitous evils. I'm not going to shoulder the tremendously heavy burden of proof by saying there's never been a single gratuitous evil in the history of the world. I ain't going there. But if you just consider the gratuitous evils as well as all of the other evils that might be there, then all of those taken into account together, both those that don't need to be there for anything that God's just stuck with, and those that may ultimately contribute to something that is better, then all of those are factored in. So I don't think that every evil is gratuitous, but I do think that some are, and that this argument says why we have a world that has a mixture of different qualities of evil.
Tim.
Thank you, Kirk, for an awesome talk. I've learned a lot from you over the last few years.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for sharpening me in my thinking. I guess the first question I'd like to ask is, if God creates, and so the universe and humanity is necessarily less than perfect, and so metaphysically evil right off the bat, would this seem to explain why humanity is in a sinful and separated and fallen state, even without the need for Adam and Eve and a snake and an apple? So maybe for the person who revolts against Christianity because of maybe the creation account, is this something you could give somebody who might struggle with that, do you think?
I would say definitely it is. And it's interesting that one prominent 20th century theologian who is not read very much at all by evangelicals, except critically, which I personally think is a mistake. I am not endorsing this fellow's thought. There's a lot of problems with his thought, but I do think that there are valuable nuggets of truth to be mined, and that's the thought of Paul Tillich, who, along with Karl Barth, was one of the 20th century's most influential theologians. And Tillich basically identified the fall in precisely those metaphorical terms, by saying that the fall could be understood as a symbol of that human beings in their state where they are not displaying completeness or wholeness in each and every respect, and therefore find themselves experiencing various evils. I wouldn't say that they are metaphysically evil, that people are, or that the creation is, but I'm saying that these things would just display certain evils, certain defects. Then that fact of feeling this separation from God and needing to be in relationship with God, that state is what is metaphorically depicted by the fall. And so even though I wouldn't myself endorse that line of thinking, nevertheless, I think that for the skeptic of any historicity in Genesis whatsoever, then why not use that? That's a perfectly legitimate argument.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, we have time. We'll take another question, and actually, does anyone?
I have one more.
Well, we could take a couple more. If you have to go, feel free to go ahead and go, because I know we reached 8 o'clock. Don't feel bad about it. But we'll go ahead. Anyone else who hasn't asked a question?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So you guys, all right, Trevor, we'll let you ask yours.
Hey, Kirk, it's me again.
All right.
My question revolves around kind of similar to what the gentleman behind Tim was saying earlier, but a little different. I have a statement and then I have a question that revolves around the statement.
Okay.
But it's kind of a question also. I've never understood, at least, the problem, so to speak, of gratuitous evil to be whether or not the purpose of the evil is to bring about good, as much as whether or not it actually does bring about good. Now, my question is, if we're dealing with a God who creates the best possible world, so to speak.
Right.
And we're dealing with a God who knows through counterfactual knowledge.
Right.
Then wouldn't it make sense that any evil which could possibly be gratuitous, but has even the slightest possibility of bringing about good in any sense, in any spectrum of the universe, then that would lean towards the greater possible world, and therefore God would indeed create such a world. And so, in a sense, there would be no gratuitous evil in the world that God would create. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And it seems there that, again, it's a question of the burden of proof. It seems that while that could be true, I don't deny that that might be the case, it seems to me extraordinarily unlikely. So to put it another way, I am teaching a logic class this semester, and when I give a logic quiz, I give a logic quiz every Friday. Students hate me for this, but I give a logic quiz every Friday. And what I do, I know, and it's the case because I give challenging quizzes, that I'm not going to get any perfect scores. And I don't get any perfect scores. Now, that means that if I were to pick a favorite student of the week, and let's suppose I'm just going to do this based on the score, and the best I can get is a 97, does that -3 in any way contribute to that paper's being good? It seems to me the answer is no. It contributes nothing to the goodness of it. And so that -3 would be gratuitous. It would be pointless. And so I'm thinking, why couldn't all the worlds that God is confronted with be like that? Have these various minuses, these gratuitous evils that don't contribute ultimately to anything. Now, granted, God in his goodness picks one that ultimately is the best that God can get, just like I'm going to pick among the 97%. But nevertheless, that remaining, 3% or those evils, they don't in any sense contribute to a good or help to bring about some good.
Okay.
So that would be my reason for saying I think that there would be some gratuitous evil, but you could be right. And if you're right, then you could just show that the argument is doubly fallacious, that both premises 1 and 2 in the probabilistic version of the problem of evil fail.
Yeah, so in response to that, that was a good response. I would say that what I'm trying to convey to you is the idea that 3% away from perfection.
Yeah.
It's possible that 3% could cause that student or some other student to study harder and do better in life later on and grow closer to God somehow. So my question is, the very possibility that which you call gratuitous evil could not be for a greater good, if God were to create the best possible world, would he not choose to bring that good, that so-called gratuitous evil, to bring about a good means, if it's even possible?
Yeah.
I guess that's my question.
The answer is yes, and the question is then, is it possible? I mean, that's really going to be the whole issue here. Is that possible? So, sure, if God can get a world that's tied for the best of all feasible worlds and, this evil ultimately contributes to some good down the road, then sure, of course God would want to pick that kind of a world. But what I'm saying is that even though that's possible, nevertheless, I'm not sure we need to worry about trying to defend ourselves against the attacks of skeptics by saying, yeah, that's what we're committed to right there. We're going to hang our hat on that possibility. It seems to me far more prudent to say, well, it could be that you just have the -3 on all of the worlds, and the -3 doesn't do any good for anything, anywhere, and yet God still picks it. You've got the -3, and that doesn't in any way invalidate God's existence or make God's existence improbable. But I think you're right that it could be, and of course, only God knows the answer.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kirk.
You're welcome.
Does he have a question?
It's related to the last question.
Do you have a question that you want to ask?
Well, it was sort of some conjecture on the question you just asked.
That's up to them.
Well, do you have, how many more could we ask?
That's what. It doesn't matter. As long as everybody wants to stay, it's fine with me.
Okay, so you were talking about, and I'm really sorry. Maybe you guys already talked about this. So should have happened through this. But you were asking about gratuitous evil being ultimately good, and therefore not being evil in the long run, right?
Yeah, that's not exactly what I was getting at, but I think it's kind of my question. It was geared more towards what God would do if certain things.
But when I first came in, he was talking about how evil was a lack of something. So
yeah, well, I asked him a question about that.
Right. And what it was, if you scored a 97% of the test, and then you went back and you took the test and scored 100%, like you still have that 97% of the whole record. Like maybe it's not reported in the school record.
No, my question.
Can you hear that, Kirk?
I can barely hear it.
Okay, well, what I would like to ask you is, if you have a question, direct it to him, and then that way we can be more productive.
I think you misunderstood.
Okay. Well, no, I wasn't a question. It was more conjecture.
Oh, okay.
I was just trying to open up some new thoughts to the idea.
Well, let's go ahead. Tim, you had a question from Kirk. I thought you had a question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kirk, I like how you pointed out that there is no such thing as a best of all possible worlds. You can always add one more saved person to each world. You can keep growing in that manner. I like how you said there's worlds that are tied for the best of all possible worlds. But I'm thinking if you know, in God's economy, that the best worlds are those who freely choose to love him. Could there be a best of all feasible worlds once you consider human libertarian free will? And that even though it's logically possible for 100% of humanity to love, to freely choose to love God, that's logically possible. But once you consider libertarian free will, could there be a best of all feasible worlds, that there is a world in which if God actualizes world X, then in this world the most people will freely choose to love God for all eternity?
Yeah, it's possible. And I think that the issue is, that's possible, but is it probable? And it seems to me that it's improbable that that's the case. I think that our world is a world that is tied for the best of all feasible worlds. I think that seems to make a lot more sense, because as I think about it, even if this world, maxes out on every single category, how do you know that that's the only world that does? Now, sure, it's possible that this is the only world that does, but it seems also equally possible that it could have wound up in a different way. So to illustrate with me as an example, I could imagine, say, 3 worlds. Let's imagine 3, quote, tied for the best of all feasible worlds. And these worlds, they all measure up the same. They all contain the same amount of salvation versus condemnation. They all have the lowest possible amount of gratuitous evil, and so forth. Now, suppose in world 1, I freely choose to respond to God's grace and am saved. And in world 2, I freely reject God's grace and am lost. But somebody else responds to God's grace and is saved. And in world 3, I don't exist, and some other person exists, and they respond to God's grace and is saved. Now, I'm not so arrogant to think that there's something so great about me that, I'm all that, and therefore God's going to pick the world with me in it where I get saved. No, that doesn't seem at all to be the case. And so it seems, why couldn't God have picked this other world where someone else is saved rather than me, and I still exist, and God reaches out to me with every effort to save me, but I just spurn it, or a world where I don't exist? It seems, just if you're talking about possibilities, that it's more likely that you have these other possible worlds that are tied with ours for the best feasible world than that ours is just the best. Now, you could be right that maybe this is the only world that maxes out in the various categories. And if it is, then God would therefore create this world. And we honestly don't know that, and that's a good question to ask God.
God would know.
That's right, God does know.
Yeah, right.
Can I ask one just simple, basic question? Kirk, my last question is, considering your view that all possible, all the tied worlds, would you say that leaves open, it seems to me that if that is the case, then that leaves open the possibility for God himself to have libertarian free will.
This is an entirely different topic, whether or not God has libertarian free will. And even though I would have to defend this at much greater length elsewhere, I'm inclined to think that God does have libertarian free will.
So do I.
Now, not everybody believes that. I realize that. Some people would say, no, God doesn't have libertarian free will, but I'm not of that persuasion. I would need probably about 6 months to fine-tune my thoughts and to put it into an article form, but that's at least where I stand right now. So yes, I think that this tied for the best of all feasible worlds not only is compatible with God having libertarian free will, but it also makes perfectly good sense of God's sovereignty. It makes perfectly good sense of God's predestination. It makes perfectly good sense of a lot of what the Calvinists want so firmly to hold. And the Calvinist thinks the only way I can do that is to give up libertarian free will. And the Molinist says, no, not so fast. You can still have libertarian free will in this scenario. You really have an infinite range of equally good worlds. All these worlds tied for the best of all feasible worlds. And you've got one among them, at least, where I'm freely saved. Another among them where I'm freely lost. Another among them where I don't exist. And so on and so forth. Then it ultimately is up to God which of those worlds he's going to select. And that choice would be God's act of predestination. So I think that God's sovereignty and kind of the strengths of the Calvinistic view are greatly enhanced on this middle knowledge type scheme. So I think you're absolutely right.
Cool. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Anybody else?
I had, this is more of a Molinist.
Yes.
On what it is that Molinists believe. But because what you just said, you said that something about God creates a universe or a world in which I freely choose him, and then God creates a world in which I freely reject him.
Yeah.
I kind of understood the perspective to be God basically knows which I will choose, so he creates the world in which I make the free choice.
Right.
He doesn't create the world in which because given the choice, I would freely choose him, and because I freely choose him, that's the world he creates. He can't create the world in which I freely reject him, because given the choice, I freely choose him. So logically, he can't create the world in which I freely reject him, because given the actual choice to choose or reject, I freely choose him. So he can't create that other world. That's the way I understood the moment.
Yeah.
How am I wrong?
That's not what Molina would say, and here's the reason why. Okay. You are correct that in the precise circumstances that you did choose God, in those circumstances, it's logically impossible for God to create a world where you reject him. But why can't God create you in other circumstances? That's the whole issue. So, granted, it's logically impossible for God to create me in the same circumstances in which he created me, and yet in those circumstances for me to reject him, because God knows that in those circumstances I would freely be saved. Granted, but God could create me, say my parents meet, they get together, I'm created, I have the same self-identity that I do right now, and the circumstances are different. And why can't God create a world like that, where the circumstances happen to be different? And maybe in that world, I freely reject him. So I think that among those two alternatives, the one that seems more honest to myself, when I just am brutally honest with myself and say, am I really prepared to say that I'm all that I'm so good that, it's logically impossible for God to create a world where I reject him? I think that's false. I think that I can easily imagine circumstances where I would have just as much a fair shake, even a better chance at salvation than I do in this world, and yet I freely choose to reject him. I can imagine that quite easily if I'm brutally honest with myself. And I also think this is the best and certainly most straightforward understanding of Jesus' teaching in Matthew 11:20-24, where Jesus says concerning the people in the cities where most of his miracles were done, because those cities did not repent. He says, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the miracles done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. Nevertheless, it will be better for the people in Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you. And woe to you, Capernaum, for if the miracles done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. So there, taken at face value, it seems that Jesus is saying that yes, he knows via middle knowledge that if the miracles that he did in Capernaum or in Bethsaida had been done in these other places instead, then people who are lost in the actual world would have been saved in that world. And that world is possible for God to create. So God just, it's up to him which of those worlds he's going to choose. So where you're quite right is that if God keeps the circumstances the same as this world all the way through, then you're right. God can't create a world where you reject him because God knows what you would do in that set of circumstances. But God's not bound to just to create this set of circumstances. He could create another.
Well, it's interesting, and I'd have to look at that passage in Matthew a little bit more, but is it possible that Jesus could have just been using hyperbole?
Well, that's what William Lane Craig thinks. And that's, take whichever view that you want. Take whichever view that you want. So Craig thinks that it's hyperbole. I don't. And just for whatever it's worth, Molina didn't think that it was hyperbole.
Well, the question I have that's related to this then is, it seems to me, and this is kind of, maybe it's just my lack of understanding about Molinism. It seems to me that circumstances dictating what you choose is a form of determinism.
Well, yeah, if the circumstances did determine what you choose, that would be determinism. But I don't think the circumstances do in any way have a causal connection with what you choose. I think that it's utterly indeterministic what you choose, and it's just that God knows which way it's going to go, and that God has that knowledge innately just by virtue of being omniscient. So I like to think about some type of indeterministic physical process, and such as, when is this uranium atom going to, indeterministically decay? Well, it's nothing that determines that it's this moment or that moment. It's not that the circumstances in any way make it decay at this moment or that moment. It's just that God, being omniscient, knows that in these circumstances it would indeterministically decay at this moment, or it would indeterministically decay at that moment. And the same with our choices. It's not the case that my circumstances in any way dictate what I will do. It's just the case that God knows in those circumstances how things would freely and indeterministically turn out.
Trevor, you said you only had
just a simple question about Molinism, based on what you just said.
Trevor has one more question.
Based on what you just said, it seems like, I'm gonna try to clarify what you said and ask a very simple question that just requires a yes or no, really. It seems like you're saying that to be, from the Molinist perspective, nothing can be determined. But I've understood Molinism, so my question is, in Molinism, as Molina understood it,
yes,
was it just within the bounds of libertarian free will, which necessitates a personhood, a mind, a creature with mentality, that the indeterministic nature of the view stands?
Yeah, Molina doesn't think at all that nothing is determined.
Okay.
I don't think that either. But what I think is the best view of science is that there are certain indeterministic processes, and that God's middle knowledge accounts for them, and that our choices are indeterministic, and that God's middle knowledge takes account what those choices will be just by virtue of God being omniscient. So I don't at all believe that everything in the world is indeterministic. If I believed that, I would really be living in a spooky world. You know, I would be worried, is my alarm really going to go off the next day and get me to class? You know, what in the world's going to happen? Is my TV going to just blow up tonight when I watch the NBA playoff game? I don't worry about that. So I do think that there are various things that are deterministic.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Good answer.
You're welcome.
Brother.
So this is one final non-technical question. Are you a Cubs fan?
Well, that's interesting because not being originally from here, being originally from Northwest Ohio, I've always, either been rooting for the Reds or rooting for the Indians.
Oh.
And I really, since moving here, I've never, really picked a team. I've never sort of been inclined to be a White Sox fan for whatever reason. I did watch the Cubs with great interest last year and was definitely rooting for them. And I do certainly hope that they win the World Series this year and finally end the curse.
Well,
I have a more important question. Are you a Hawkeye fan?
are you a
I'm definitely a Hawkeye fan. I am a hardcore Iowa Hawkeye fan, even though it drives my wife crazy. This means that I go into a conniption fit when Iowa's losing a football game or a basketball game, and was going nuts when Iowa in basketball lost to Penn State, which I just was like, this is inexcusable. Iowa can't. So yes.
Well, good answer. Good answer. Well, Kirk, thanks again for joining us.
You're very welcome.
And I really enjoyed getting to meet you virtually. I hope I get to meet you someday in person.